Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth panel of the First Sea Lords Conference. I'm Ashlee Godwin. I'm Head of International Affairs and National Security at the House of Commons, and it's my pleasure to chair this panel today. So this session will build on today's earlier sessions by asking which navies might work together in the 2040s and how they might do so that we are stronger together. So to give a few opening thoughts on this session, it's clear that the Royal Navy and its partners, many of whom are represented here today, face big questions in designing and delivering the maritime forces of the 2040s. The first big question is what will they be protecting and where? We've seen a flurry of recent articles heralding a new age of sea power based on the growing connectivity of the global economy through trade, undersea cables and energy pipelines. Looking ahead, this will almost certainly evolve and potentially deepen, both as economic power shifts, trading patterns change with the transition to a more green economy, and also as the mix of maritime infrastructure evolves to include more offshore sites such as wind farms and undersea sites for deep-sea mining. There will also be entirely new demand for maritime security in areas such as the Arctic and the Northern Sea route, with climate change eventually opening up these to shipping, resource exploitation, and military transit all year round. And then, of course, there is the question of whom or what we might need maritime security, against whom or what we might need maritime security in the 2040s. So this audience will be more than familiar with the way in which the balance of naval power is currently tilting away from the West. China and Russia in particular are both intent and investing in their maritime capabilities and manifesting a much more aggressive intent, whether in the form of grey zone coercion, the subversion of international laws, or in Russia's case, direct conflict. We know too, and we heard in the earlier session, that non-state actors also pose a threat in the maritime domain. We need only look at events in the Red Sea and the actions of Chinese fishing militia in the South China Sea to glimpse the potential future role of state proxies. And at the same time, of course, there is the issue of criminality at sea, with the MOD's global strategic trends suggesting that illicit fishing, piracy, and so forth will become more prevalent as already vulnerable regions around the world feel the effects of climate change. And of course, to sort of create a more complete risk picture, climate change also poses wider risks for the maritime domain in the form of more frequent and intense natural disasters, both onshore and at sea, that ultimately require a seaborne response of some kind. So that's the what, the where, against whom and against what. But what about the capabilities with which we'll pursue maritime security in the 2040s? Well, here I use the term capabilities in the broadest sense. Again, this audience will know better than most the debates around the role of emerging tech and innovation in maritime forces, and, of course, how this interacts with questions around mass in terms of both platforms and skilled personnel. Suffice to say that the conflict in Ukraine alone and the cycle of innovation it's provoked raises important questions around the role of uncrewed seaborne and aerial vehicles, missile capabilities, electronic warfare, and space-based systems, to name just a few. To this list of capability considerations, we absolutely must add industry as well as the infrastructure, including shipyards, and skills that support the scaling and evolution of that industry. That is clearly something we are relearning rather painfully at the moment, as so many of the UK and its allies seek to put their economies and industrial bases back on a war footing. And last but by no means least, I come to our alliances and partnerships and the collective capability these can offer. How do the Royal Navy and its partners plan, deliver, and operate together to tackle this somewhat daunting collection of maritime security demands in an age of information-enabled battlefields and multi-domain operations? From the UK perspective, we benefit from the long-standing operational relationships with the US and within NATO and with the five-power defence arrangements grouping. But as the recent announcement on potential AUKUS cooperation with Japan shows, there is appetite and perhaps a need to do more. But this will in turn require us to think about crossing cultural divides as well as the practicalities of deeper cooperation. So to discuss the vision and practicalities for how the Royal Navy and its partners can work together to navigate these complex dynamics, it's my great pleasure to introduce briefly our three panelists whose full biographies you can find in the conference programme. So Admiral James Kilby is the Vice Chief of Naval Operations in the US Navy, a role he has held since January 2024, having previously served as Deputy Commander of the US Fleet Forces Command. Vice Admiral Martin Connell has served as the second Sea Lord in the Royal Navy since January 2022, in which role he is responsible for the delivery of the Royal Navy's future capabilities, strategy and long-term programme, and is the Royal Navy's Principal Personnel Officer. And Air Vice Marshal Finn Monahan is Director of the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, the independent think tank of the UK's MOD. So, AVM Finn, perhaps I could come to you first to set the scene a little. I've spoken briefly about the emerging trends we see today. From your perspective in DCDC, what do you see as the key geopolitical, economic and technological trends that shape the future priorities and operating environment for navies by 2040?
Super, thank you very much. And First Sea Lord, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm here as a joint officer, but you can see that I am a Royal Air Force officer. But I'm also particularly proud of my relationship with the Royal Navy, which I think is quite important for Britain, because we're one of the few Royal Air Forces, or one of the few air forces that flies at sea as well as flying on land. And I've spent my career flying on carriers from my very first tour. So I really have appreciated learning about the Royal Navy. And then years down the line, when I was director of the JFAC, immediately after the invasion of Ukraine, understanding what's going on board those ships was so important to me, as we had 5 carrier groups that were sitting there, obviously taking part in the deterrence of Russia. And I also have read JATSpeak, which is very important. So up front, I think one of the things at DCDC, we are just about to publish Global Strategic Trends. Many of you will know about that document. For those of you who don't, it is Defence's future publication going out to 30 years. So I'll draw a bit on that, but also draw on the other 2 publications that we've recently had approved by the Defence Force Development Board, which are the campaigning and the warfighting concepts. And I've taken copious notes today, so I'll refer to some of that as I go along, because I think there have been some really interesting things that have come out. I think from the discussion today, we all agree that we're in an era of constant competition, punctuated by simultaneous crises and conflict. But the important thing is that competition doesn't stop when we hit the point of warfare. We will continue to be in competition, and throughout everything we do, and certainly the analysis that we are doing at DCDC, is that we need to make sure that we are competitive and we remain competitive throughout the continuum of competition, and that the challenges we have are interconnected, and also, this has been mentioned quite a few times, globally interconnected. Why? This is because we've got a global landscape that's going to become increasingly crowded out to 2040 and beyond. Whilst we're thinking about Russia today, and many of us focus on Russia and lots of lessons coming out of the situation in Ukraine, we've got many other things going on that we are looking way out 30 or 40 years. We've got changing demographics, economic growth, meaning that there are going to become a number of emerging medium nations as well as the major nations, which are going to really be things that we need to consider in the future. And that's something I haven't really heard mentioned that much today. Alongside that, we're going to see many globally relevant actors. Violent extremist transnational criminal networks are going to be very important to us, corporates and global elites as well. And the outlook for all of these is very uncertain, as it is for us, I think. All of us in the world are wrestling with this. This is what competition is. Where might Russia be in a year's time is a good question to start asking yourself, because you might start thinking about having to look elsewhere. Will China overtake the US as the #1 global economy? Could the US turn more inward? Does a rising India mean something to us? What does that mean? And what does all this mean for alliances and partnerships, which is particularly important to this panel? And then, of course, the international system. We've heard about the international system being challenged. We are looking probably further out than most people, and we can no longer assume that the international system established in Bretton Woods after World War II will necessarily endure. We have seen more global shocks in history than that. So if we want to preserve it, we need to make sure we really do work hard to protect it. And we have, as the 6th biggest economy in the world, we have agency in our future, and that's really important. Historically, such a crowded landscape has often led to war, so it's very important that the Royal Navy does prepare for war, and I've heard fight tonight mentioned a few times today. Absolutely. And how to do that? Well, obviously, deterring through provision of conventional deterrence, contributing to the resilience of the nation as a whole. That's really important. I've heard a lot about undersea cables as well today. But also, of course, the custodian of the nuclear force, and that's really important, particularly at the moment with growing stockpiles and also destabilizing use of intermediary and hypersonic weapons. And with that, uncertain and opaque doctrines from some of the adversaries that we see out there, and also increasingly aggressive rhetoric on their use. And I just point you towards the OSCE conversations that were taking place last week and Russia's statements on use of nuclear. Very concerning. So the Royal Navy, I think, needs to, in this context, identify which wars it might need to fight. There is obviously the Russia in the Euro-Atlantic area, but there are very many other areas in which we're going to see rising middle powers that we need to be very cognizant of. But also, we need to think about the vulnerabilities of adversaries, and that's very important because sometimes we think on the defensive, and that's something that I think is really important. Looking out globally, looking at the challenges to us, but looking also at where our adversaries have vulnerabilities. But it's not just all about warfighting, and this is something that it's very easy to get completely focused on Russia, Euro-Atlantic. We need to think about other things. The Navy needs to be prepared for a world of intensifying rivalry. That could fracture into competing spheres of influence, something like a modern version of the Great Game. And this could be aligned along ideological, trade, digital, and other lines. And that's something that we express in global strategic trends. So definitely worth a look. If not quite a Cold War, it may share some of the elements of rivalry for military technology and operational supremacy, along with all of the associated costs that come with that. And we talked earlier on about the potential for there being an arms race. Well, I think we are already in that arms race. And our current focus on autonomy and automation and directed energy weapons and the like, that could very easily turn into an arms race in its own right, even though we're just trying to supplement our mass there. But it's not just wars. Periods of rivalry are not the only potential future that we've got. We've got growing energy needs, which will see renewable energy taking on increasing prominence. And that could well lead to intensifying competition to provide those technologies, and that will probably take place over congested and contested maritime territories. And then also changing patterns of trade and new sources of production are really important. Additive manufacturing and onshoring could lead to competition for commodities, food, and even water, increasingly pushing us into the shared spaces like the poles and the oceans. And there may well be, for example, more critical minerals on the seabed than across the rest of the world combined. That's probably true. So these areas could well become the Klondikes of the 21st century, and in that rush to gain riches and to gain energy, etc., the Navy will be particularly important in upholding the rules and norms of the high sea. Other things I think that we need to think about, there are pressures from climate change, which are likely to have more frequent, violent, and permanent impacts on coastal megacities, infrastructure, trade routes, and on the sovereignty of some states, like small islands. That, of course, has maritime consequence. And through all of this, the Royal Navy needs to make sure that it has an important role in promoting and protecting the prosperity, and we've mentioned prosperity today, conducting diplomacy, and contributing to things like disaster relief and non-combatant evacuation operations. All of this continues whilst at the same time needing to make sure that we prepare for warfare. And in the expression of UK maritime power in competition, crisis, and conflict, everything that we do will continue to be visceral, and that was mentioned in the last panel. It's a human undertaking made possible by sailors and Marines, and increasingly an integrated body of people collaborating across the 5 domains, as well as the defence enterprise and wider society, and of course with allies and partners. And all of this is really important. It's integrating and conducting multi-domain operations is where we need to go to maintain strategic advantage. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very briefly, can I just probe a bit more on what deterrence and securing strategic advantage at sea might look like in practice in the 2040s, if you could just cover that briefly?
Would you just repeat that? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Sorry. What might deterrence and securing strategic advantage at sea look like in practice in the 2040s? So,
deterrence. Now, there is a question. We're actually in the process of refreshing our deterrence doctrine at DCDC at the moment, and this is really important because we are seeing. I sit there imagining a dual-use hypersonic missile coming towards me. What are my actions? That is important to understand, and also we have adversaries whose we don't know what their red lines are. We don't understand necessarily what their doctrine is, so that therefore becomes a real challenge for us. So dual use really important, but then we also have deterrence. We're working on integrated deterrence, making sure that we're integrated right the way across the nation, working across government, because the very fact, we've got conventional deterrence as well as nuclear deterrence. They go hand in hand. They are linked, but we need to make sure that we truly are resilient, so that when people look at us as a nation, we really can demonstrate that we are ready to fight tonight, not just as a force, but as a nation. And national resilience, I think, is supremely important to us. And then we also get into things like undersea cables and looking at our own gaps, but also we need to look at the vulnerabilities of others. And I give you a little point. 70% of China's internet cabling goes via Taiwan. That is a vulnerability for them. And that's something that we should be exploiting, for example.
Thank you very much. You mentioned integrated deterrence, which was obviously a concept introduced in the US National Defence Strategy as well. So on that, I will turn to Admiral Jim. I was wondering if you could give us a view from the United States. It's been a decade now since the US and UK set out their vision for naval cooperation, that's known as delivering combined sea power. So as our 2 countries seek to develop navies that are fit for the 2040s, what are the most important points of bilateral cooperation and why?
Ashlee, thanks for the question. First Sea Lord, thank you for the invitation. You know, this setup is a little bit like testifying before Congress, but it seems to be a much friendlier audience here today than I'm used to. It is a pleasure to be here. Uniquely, I've been involved in DCS since 2019, LOE4, which I'll talk about in a minute, in a job called the N9, which is the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Requirements and Capabilities, and that's emerging technologies. And then lastly, in my last job as a deputy at Fleet Forces for Carrier Strike, and that was a fantastic opportunity. So I think Finn did a super job outlining the challenges before us and maybe the world we're going to face. I really think DCS, the more I've listened today, is a wonderful model for us to replicate and move forward. When I worked for Admiral Roden, we talked about currency and proficiency in the surface force. And to me, DCS allows us to have currency and proficiency between our 2 navies, and that's an important, enduring relationship. I commented in a panel recently that frequently in my career we've done a thing called PASSEXes, and that's a passing exercise. And while those are of value, they're short, usually brief, and not deep. And I thought about a conversation I had with Simon earlier today where we talked about Formidable Shield, which is a 3-week exercise off the Hebrides range, working together against complex threats. And that's where we must go. The carrier cooperation agreement is just on its 2nd iteration. In fact, Anthony Remington is the UK lead for that with my relief, Admiral Gumbleton. trying to make our forces interoperable. And that's not a small task. I mean, the UK is our closest ally with several others, but we still have to work at it. And we have to work at these challenges and barriers that were a little bit unknown to us until we were operating together. One example, exchanging blood. I can't take blood from the UK, which is ridiculous, but that's a policy and an impediment to how we would fight and operate. So that's just one of many, many challenges that we have to work for. But the Carrier Strike Group 21 deployment was a remarkable success. And it was USS the Sullivans accompanied Queen Elizabeth and other ships on a long deployment and did things they didn't imagine doing when we started the SOI. So I think we're in that place now where we're going to have that same opportunity. And that opportunity will happen in 2025, which I think is fantastic. You know, I talked to Admiral Crendandino, and I didn't talk to our French allies today, but we're going to have a series of Italian carrier operations in the Pacific, French carrier operations in the Pacific, UK carrier operations in the Pacific over the next year, and that's a wonderful signal. That operation is called Operation High Mast, and we want to make, it seems to me, between our two nations, these operations increasingly more challenging. We want to make a step function increase in operating together and not just do the same thing over and over again. And that's the challenge and the work that Anthony and Admiral Gumbleton are leading. The second effort is undersea superiority. So clearly, the UK and the United States have been together in this undersea really journey for almost 60 years. And we've just signed with AUKUS, and that's another enduring commitment to operate together. I see a lot of potential between our three nations to be very challenging and to make each of our nations better in that effort and to create a challenge for our adversaries. So I think that LOE, while AUKUS is not part of LOE 2 in the DCS, they are related. And I think we should double down on those technologies moving forward. The third one's littoral operations. So that's a different way of doing business. To me, the Marines and the United States Marine Corps and Navy and the Royal Navy working together maybe in a different manner. The way I talk about General Berger's force design is flipping the script in that we're not just power projecting Marines, U.S. Marines ashore, but we're having Marines project power at sea. And that's a challenge too. And we should operate closer together in the U.S. I should be able to use the track from a Gator radar to close a fire control loop with an Aegis ship. And we should be able to exchange that with all our allies. So I think that's a third opportunity in LOE number 3. And the last one is integrated warfighting, which is this area we've talked around today, new systems, how do we deploy things differently? I talked to Jamie on the break about, yes, I agree, we need to deploy things differently. I think the Proteus vessel, which I just saw yesterday, is an example of that and how we would have a vessel that would deploy uncrewed things to complement our force. But the fact is we're going to have 70% of what we're going to have in 2040 is what we have today. So we have to make that work. It can't, it's not, in a commentary of another comment, it's an and, it's not an or. We've got to do both things. And we're trying to do that very hard, in a very focused manner with the United States Navy. I think we need to stay connected, which is going to be increasingly more challenging. And that's the point of the DCS and these other agreements, that we kind of work together in a manner that's more effective. And we need to aggressively look for those barriers which exist and remove them and not ignore them. And that's the purpose of our SOI and the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. So I see a lot of opportunity here. I see Admiral Sakai in the front row. I thanked him on my last deployment when I was in the Pacific. For a lot of reasons, I deployed with 3 combatants in a carrier, and at one point I had 1 combatant because they were doing other things. And I called my dear friend Charlie Williams, who was CTF-70, and I said, I need some help. We're going to sail through the South China Sea. and a squadron of JMSDF ships joined us, and we sailed through the East China Sea to do our mission. So that is an example of allies and partners being where you need them when they count. And I don't even know, frankly, if our senior governments understood what had happened, but I was sure appreciative of that. So with that, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us all in this room to do what we said we're going to do, what we committed to work together as allies and partners. The DCS is an example of how to do that in a formal manner.
Thanks, Admiral Jim. You mentioned that 70% of the forces we will have in 2040 are basically what we have today, and we need to make that work. On that note, how is the US shaping its future forces and operations, and how do you envisage that future force teaming with the Royal Navy and other allies and partners, including many of those represented here?
Well, we have very similar challenges to the UK. Sir, when I read your future plan, that is like our future plan. We are designing our force design, which is different than it is today. We have a annual game, which we run in Newport, Rhode Island, to try to look at alternative futures, alternative force designs. The tricky part of that is what I also talked to Jamie about is concept of deployment. We tend to talk about concept of operations. Concept of deployment means I need to understand how to get that capability there, how to sustain it, how to deploy it and recall it potentially so I can reuse it again, which is a different problem set than the PRC have, frankly, because we have to, both of our navies go forward to do that and sustain that in a different manner. So we're not solving the same problem. We have a different problem to solve there. I think the Red Sea, we should not kid ourselves, is not the highest end fight. It is a challenging fight. It's a thinking, reorienting adversary who's changing his tactics every day, and we should acknowledge that. But it's not the same fight. But we are getting crews trained, and they are performing in the Red Sea, as many of you in this room are doing too. We are moving forward in uncrewed in the United States Navy. I don't think we're doing it as quickly as we could. We've had a few false starts, to be honest with you. And we want to deploy capability in an area called sea denial, which is more vexing for our adversary. And we want to complement our conventional forces with that. And we've been exercising with you, with Task Force 59 in the Arabian Gulf, as well as Fourth Fleet, as well as Indo-Pacific battle problems. So I think that's an opportunity for us as well. We're investing in how to change our networks and use information by prioritization versus by what means we usually transmit it. So that's called Project Overmatch in the United States Navy. And that prioritization scheme allows us to use software-defined radios to exchange information in a more effective manner, and I think that is something we should certainly do together. We have a similar journey in the Red Sea. When things happen, how can we take that engagement, process that data, and learn from it very quickly? And we worked with industry, an industry partner, Lockheed Martin, as a matter of fact, and some of our surface warfare centers to get that data, reduce it, and return it, and explain to that crew what happened. And did the weapon system work the way we thought it would? And if it didn't, can we install a patch quickly? Project Overmatch allows us to do that as well. Or did we have a problem with our tactics, techniques, and procedures that we need to get out and spread around the fleet as quickly? So there's a learning cycle that has been re-emphasized in the United States Navy. And lastly, I think live virtual constructive is an important technology for us to share with our allies, because there are certain tactics and techniques that we don't want to divulge to our adversary, and we want to use it in a secure manner where we can actually exercise our forces against the numbers that we think we're going to encounter. And that's a challenge because we don't have that many adversary aircraft and we can't fly them on scale in the United States. So creating a synthetic environment to allow us to stimulate our Navy is where we're investing, and I think we should share that as well so we can train together. I think those are some important things for us to think about as we move forward.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And with that, I will turn to Admiral Martin to ask quite a simple question, at least the question simple, maybe not the answer. What does all of this mean for the Royal Navy? How and with which partners will the Royal Navy operate in the 2040s?
Thanks, Ashlee. I think wisdom on alliances and partnerships is clearly not a new thing. And Sun Tzu said, if an enemy has alliances, the problem is grave, and the enemy's position is strong. If they have no alliances, the problem is minor, and the enemy's position is weak. So I suppose my challenge to everybody is, do we as friendly navies take some of that for granted? Because I'm pretty sure that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran look enviously at the partnerships that we have. And perhaps we ought to reflect on that, why that is. It doesn't happen by chance, and as other speakers have said, it's because of a confluence of national interests. That's why partnerships exist. And we've talked about what those interests are, so I shan't repeat them. But it doesn't happen just overnight either. Admiral Kilby talked about the UK-US delivering combined sea power endeavour. It is, I think, an honest reflection of where we are and where we need to be, set against all of the threats that we're likely to face in the future. And it's tough. And it requires honest conversations about where we might perhaps have relative strengths and where we might perhaps have some challenges and weaknesses. That requires absolute trust in terms of that relationship and what we might do about it. Do we have that capacity to do that with all of our partners? We probably don't. And that's okay. I think we have to be honest about why we have partners in certain places and why in other cases that's not the case. So I think the problem we've got is a great problem because we've got many partners and many alliances, and if anything, what we have to do is recognize that we can't service those to the extent that we might wish to. And you can look at those through a number of different lenses. There is the lens of, well, that foundation, the most successful alliance in history, that of NATO. I think there's still more we need to do as a Royal Navy in order to look at how we would warfight. Scenarios and the war games, we might have in the past paid a bit of lip service to how we might have worked there. Well, I think we need to pay a bit more attention to how we might need to restructure our force. Our future force design has to be through both a national force design lens and a NATO force design lens, rather than keep them separate. The Five Eyes Club, and it is a club, it's a club of very trusted intelligence sharing. That's still a thing. And we don't talk about it too much, but the threats are getting more challenging, so we have to share what information we do have among our most trusted allies. We can look at the alliances and partnerships through a capability lens. We talked about carrier cooperation. There's a submarine nuclear club. There is amphibious forces within Europe. Are we exploiting the fullest potential there? And then there are the geographical structures, such as the Joint Expeditionary Force or the five-power defense arrangements that give us the ability to operate on a global scale with partners. And those partners clearly are broader than just navies. It's the industrial base, it's partners across government, and we should never forget that in the outcomes that we're seeking. And these partnerships will always evolve. They never stand still. And let me just give you a current example. We've got a very strong and rich history and heritage with India, but in the last year or so, we have done crew swaps on different sorts of ships. We've done security cooperation and security patrols, and we're now doing maintenance of our ships in Indian yards. That is a natural evolution of that relationship, and I think it's the right thing for us to be doing, and it gives us opportunities to look at how we might do maintenance and support on a global scale rather than bring ships back to the sovereign base to do them, which just isn't efficient anymore for the sort of future threats that we've got. And then finally, I would just offer in the 2040 time frame, and Finn laid out some of the thoughts that we're having across defense. The global population is over 8 billion now. It's forecast to be over 9 billion in 2040. There is going to be an increase of competition. There's going to be an increased flow of trade, an increased demand for protein on the ocean, from the oceans. And there's going to be an increasing flow of migration set about through a number of factors, not least of all failed states and poverty that can often be driven by climate change. So as a Navy, I'm proud that we have a climate change and sustainability strategy. It's super important that we understand the environment that we will be operating in the future. Pacific Islanders care about this. Their islands may forecast to be non-existent in that time frame. Arctic sea ice is forecast to melt in the 2040 during the summer periods, and as others have said, opening up the northern sea route. We better understand how we're going to operate and how that affects the sort of partnerships that we may have to work and spend more time on in the future, perhaps work on those relationships now upstream of that.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to return to that capability lens that you mentioned very briefly. I'm conscious of time. But both AUKUS and Delivering Combined Sea Power Agenda focus on emerging and disruptive technology, notably AI and uncrewed systems. What role do you foresee for hybrid fleets by the 2040s, and how will the Royal Navy work with partners to deliver that?
AUKUS is still relatively young as a strategic alliance and framework. And as you all know, there are two pillars to that. Pillar one, we're working very closely with our United States and Australian colleagues. And that partnering thing's already happened. There are going to be Australian officers graduating from our nuclear school, as well as the United States Navy's nuclear school. So those are the people that will go on to positions of leadership in the future. So pillar one, it's strategic. We've got to think multi-decade. It affects our industrial base. And we're ambitious in terms of developing the world's most advanced attack submarine in the future. Pillar two has all of those disruptive technologies. We lead on the underwater warfare line of efforts. And in a relatively short period of time, what we've sought to do is get the capabilities that we know we have as three nations and see where it is among our collective interest and see what we can advance and get into the hands of warfighters quicker than if each single nation developed it on their own. And just a couple of examples on that. We deployed an expeditionary underwater capability out to Australia last year. We will seek to do something similar in the next couple of years. That concept doesn't have to be constrained to the Indo-Pacific. It has utility, clearly, in different platforms in different parts of the world. We are seeking to move from interoperability to interchangeability, as Admiral Kilby said. I think that's really important for the likely threats we're going to seek to find in the 2040 era. That speed of decision-making, that decision cycle from sensing through to effector is going to have to be much reduced from what it is today. So interchangeability, I think, is the key for unlocking that. So in the short term, what we're seeking to do is launch UUVs from our respective submarines and recover them from torpedo tubes. We've not done that before. Well, we've got it in place so that we're doing it now between the United States Navy and the Royal Navy. We've developed AI acoustic data tools that we're going to put into our P-8 aircraft. That will speed up decision-making and analysis on board. These are the sort of things that we're seeking to do quickly, and then other things will take more time.
Of course, thank you very much. So we have time now for Q&A from the audience.